1983, The Long Voyage Back. A classic of prepperdom, written by George Coft, otherwise known by his pen name as Luke Rheinhart. And I got a thrift copy of it, and it's good, and I really enjoyed the book, and I'm going to read a bit of it because I kind of really liked it. It starts out with a quote from the Bible, Isaiah. And there's a preface. This is not a ship's log nor an official report. Although notes we have all taken over the last year have certainly helped, it's not our collective diaries and journals. What we've tried to do for ourselves primarily, for some future readers if there are any, is to recreate what it was like for those who knew, and for us, for this small family of people who are still survivors. We make no efforts to take a global view, nor have we any pretensions to being historians. We have no thesis. We're interested in people, in those who survived the initial Holocaust, whom we met, knew, tried to save, and in some cases failed to save. How all of us, the remnants, coped with the aftermath, how we were dragged down by it, so often failing. Yet some of us survive. At this point, that alone gives our story significance. And it's divided into 5 parts: fire, ashes, water, land and spirit. And it starts out with probably one of the best openings of a prepper book I've ever had read, because it actually sets the tone quite nicely. So I will read it to you in its entirety. The room was crowded, for many of its occupants were scurrying from place to place in organised chaos. A gigantic video screen filled the north wall, showing a map of the earth with lighted and blinking symbols, indicating the deployment of weapons, forces and counter-forces. A second smaller screen high on the east wall spewed forth printed messages with an inventory of warheads, explosive power, probable targets and predicted casualties. Along the south wall were 10 desk-sized computers, each with a uniformed man watching it, just as ancient priests watched moiling entrails. Along the western wall was a long table at which 13 men were sitting, all but one of them in uniform, listening to a man at the head of the table who was speaking to them in a sullen tone of intention of the enemy, the probability of surviving various war scenarios. There was no joy or humour in the room. The seriousness had a disjointed, alienated quality, as of men working hard at a job they didn't quite understand, discussing alternatives they didn't quite believe in. The sullenness that marked many of their faces was the expression of men who were doing the job expected of them, but found themselves doing things they hadn't expected to be doing. Their voices were sometimes high-pitched, close to cracking. The eyes of a few seemed wild. When one general burst out passionately in favour of one course of action, a few looked at him as if he were mad. Others looked at him gloomily, nodding. When an admiral spoke for the opposite course of action, a few looked at him as if he were mad. Others looked at him gloomily, shaking their heads. The words spoken, whether coolly or in anger, sadness or nervous panic, all had about them a scientific detachment, as consistent and codified as the uniforms most of them wore. They were eminently reasonable words, and they poured out across the table with the sporadic urgency of a teletype machine rolling out its messages. Nullify evasive evacuation. No more than 80 million. Reduce counter-strike potential by 42%. The state of belligerency inherent in. Dilute the economic infrastructure. Diversification of missile response. The reduced military options necessitated by the higher kill ratio. The incidental effects of maximizing radiation. Nullifying recuperative capacity. Behind the 10 desks, the 10 uniforms stared at the 10 computers. On the north wall, the giant screen blinked out its kaleidoscope of pulsating lights like a pinball machine. A few uniformed men stared up at it as if waiting for it to tally the final score. Eventually, the men at the table seemed to have reached some sort of decision. A telephone was brought to one of them. With the receiver at his ear, he waited patiently for the connection. The others watched, some smoking, others staring at the table. No one spoke. No one bothered to look at either of the video screens. No one smiled. The man with the phone began speaking respectfully into the receiver, paused, listened, then spoke again. Two orderlies began placing cups and saucers in front of the officers and poured out a hot, steaming liquid. He cleared his throat and uttered a simple declarative sentence indicating that the man he had spoken to had decided to adopt the course of action they had just recommended. No one spoke. No one leapt into action. No one smiled. One man sipped at the hot, steaming liquid, then another man followed suit. At the end of the table opposite the presiding officer, a man began to cry. The officer opposite glared angrily. Two other men looked away, tight-lipped. The presiding officer began to speak again in a tense, gloomy voice, addressing first one man and then another down the table. One by one they rose to depart, most hurried. No one spoke. No one smiled. Finally there were two of them left at the table, the presiding officer and the man who was crying. The first, sullen and gloomy, rose and left. Only one man was left. Pretty good stuff. Lots to think about in this book. Anyway, let me know below if you want me to actually persevere and read the whole thing, because that would be a nice summer project. So for me and Becky and Mr. Bear, au revoir. Get a copy of this. It is available second-hand for reasonable prices. If you haven't read it, it really does sum up the horror and the luck involved in surviving a nuclear war, and it does give you some ideas about how to prep and how to bug out, but it's more a cautionary tale, a tale of why we really need to never have a nuclear war. Au revoir.
It's a very heavy microphone stand. No Queen could manage this, I tell you that. It's a real man's microphone stand here, Dave. Here, where do you get these stands from? They're really heavy. So you. Well, we're going to do something really heavy in a minute. Like fall off the